Connor, let's move on. Talk about this really interesting story that Doug Bandow has wrote on, and honestly has not been covered nearly enough in the mainstream media. It seems to be a pretty substantial move. The Saudis have evicted the Lebanese diplomats and have banned Lebanese imports. Um, and I think the UAE and Bahrain followed suit on this. All over, the Lebanese information minister basically kind of saying a vanilla ish version of what me and you would summarize the war on Yemen as. So, Connor, what's going on with this?
So the guy's name is George Kordahi. I think I'm pronouncing that
That's the
approximately
Lebanese
close.
information minister.
Yes. And MBS or Riyadh anyway, described these as insulting remarks. And as you said, they've expelled the Lebanese ambassador and they've cut trade, and the UAE and Bahrain have as well now. So it was before his appointment to this position as information minister. He talked about how the Houthis are, quote, defending themselves against an external aggression. As you said, quite vanilla and really, there's really that's almost neutral. There's not much to debate about that at all. But he says he observed that homes, villages, funerals, and weddings were being bombed by the coalition, the Saudi Emirati coalition. He said, Doug says that this would be the most painful to these war criminal states. He said that the war which is approaching its seventh year, is futile and that it's time for it to end. And as Doug says, with the Emiratis disengaging and the Saudis losing. Of course, and he points out that he didn't really say anything about the U.S. And their involvement, providing military support, diplomatic support, intelligence support, a logistical support as well, even for a time, refueling the Saudi warplanes bombing Yemen. But he also talks about how, Bahrain is probably upset as well because they've been involved in this war from the beginning, not nearly as much as the Saudis and the UAEs, but they were a part of the coalition, especially at the beginning. And as he said, and there's other governments as well. He mentions that Sudan has been providing mercenaries as well due to the actual fighting, which, of course, are in the Abraham's Accords and that same sort of axis we were just talking about. But Doug's piece, he basically suggests that Lebanon should stand firm. The prime minister invited Kordahi to resign, which the George Kordahi, the information, he's refused to. He won't do it. He talks about how Lebanon is in a severe economic crisis right now, and there's significant civil unrest. We've seen some shooting in the streets over the last several weeks, and the political system seems to be breaking down here. Obviously, we've talked about it before. There have been massive oil shortages. People can't drive, having difficulty heating their homes. But as he said, Riyadh has long played a malign role, backing Sunni forces in a destructive sectarian system in which, as he says, in which political offices and economic benefits are divided among religious movements and political factions. And I believe, if you go back and look at, as Scott Horton always refers to, Cy Hirsch's piece, The Redirection, they were even backing bin Ladenite style groups, like Ansar al-Islam, I believe, in Lebanon.
And
And so,
and to go maybe even more current, we're only like 4 years off of the when Lebanon's Prime Minister Saad Hariri traveled to Saudi Arabia. He was then
yeah,
forced to sit on TV, read his own resignation, and if it wasn't for the French president basically extending an invite and saying that, look, if anybody interferes with him going from Saudi Arabia to France, you're gonna have problems with France. I don't know if he would have ever left France or Saudi Arabia alive. And so there is a lot of Saudi involvement in Lebanon. And look, even if you want to dispute kind of the narrative I put forward there, I'm sure there's a lot of Lebanese who kind of definitely feel my the narrative I put forward is true, and just realize that that's going to create a lot of anti-Saudi sentiment within Lebanon, I think.
Oh, sure, absolutely. And he also mentions that he says that, as we were discussing earlier, these talks between Iran and Saudi Arabia. Um, Doug says that rather than allowing the Lebanese to be bought and intimidated, Lebanon and the other Arab states should insist that the Saudis and Emiratis engage in a sustained dialogue with Tehran. And he talks about, like I was just saying, about how when they realized that Trump wasn't going to go to war with Iran, they started to begin those talks. So he says that that should be more encouraged, that regional states don't want to have to choose between Saudi Arabia and Iran in a way analogous to how the countries of the world don't want to have to choose between the Americans and China and the Americans and their allies, and China and their allies. So in this new Cold War. So yeah, it's just he goes through the litany of interventions that Saudi Arabia has done, not just in Lebanon, but of course backing the military coup in Egypt, and repressing the Shiite majority in Bahrain with money and troops. And so yeah, it's and of course backing Al Qaeda forces in Libya and Syria as well, with the Americans. So it's quite interesting. And yeah, it's just it sort of reminds me of what happened with Qatar a few years ago, and that blockade was only recently lifted, where it just some of this stuff seems so petty. But Saudi Arabia makes a decision, and then these other states usually get behind them, it seems like, when they pick the fact that they all just cut trade with Lebanon like that is pretty ridiculous.
Yeah, I mean, I think in a lot of ways this is pretty telling on what the human rights position of all these countries really is, where you have like this is something that could have been ignored, and in fact we would have never talked about the random statement from the Lebanese foreign minister
Yeah.
or information minister on Yemen ever. Now maybe in the Middle East, like there would have been some coverage of it and stuff like that, but not nearly as much as the amount of attention and focus that's been placed on it because of the Saudi reaction, overreaction to it. So Connor,
Especially
any
when it was before his appointment too. Like, why are you even bringing this up now?
right?
Uh
Yeah, it may not have been news for anyone then,
yeah.
right?